U.S. government for 600.
On June 2nd, 1986, this network began regular live telecasts from the Senate chamber. Adriana.
What is C-SPAN?
Yes.
If you were watching Jeopardy on April 26, 2025, you saw Adriana get it right. Yes, indeed. On June 2nd, 1986, C-SPAN did begin regular live telecasts from the Senate chamber. It was the first day of C-SPAN2, and we've been showing live gavel-to-gavel coverage of the Senate floor ever since. Here's what you heard on day one from inside the Senate chamber.
Today also begins the video history book. No longer will the great debates in this chamber be lost forever. What a thrill it would be to watch Henry Clay, John Calhoun, or Daniel Webster in action. Of course, there were no cameras or tape recorders rolling when those congressional giants spoke. But sadly, the sights and sounds of great debates featuring such legends as Everett Dirksen, Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, Howard Baker, men who have lived during the age of radio and television, were also lost forever. But now future generations can have the opportunity to watch history in the making thanks to videotape. So there are a number of good things that are about to happen.
That was Republican Majority Leader Bob Dole. And by the way, one of the senators presiding over that day's historic session on TV was Chuck Grassley. The Republican from Iowa is still in the Senate today. Also still a senator from day one of Senate TV, Kentucky Republican Mitch McConnell. That same day, June 2nd, 1986, Senator Robert Byrd, Democrat from West Virginia and then Minority Leader, appeared on C-SPAN.
Today, the Senate, which has been the invisible half of the Congress for so long, is no longer the invisible half. It's out there. And the American people who may be of the opinion, as I think is often the case, that the United States House of Representatives is the Congress, will now understand again, as they were taught in their history books, that the United States Senate is half of the Congress. And finally, I think that the American people's right to look in and to know and to see is being fulfilled.
In a few days, it will be the 39th anniversary of live gavel-to-gavel floor coverage of the U.S. Senate. On day one, as you heard, Bob Dole listed several lions of the Senate. In this episode of C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly, we hear from other lions of the Senate, lions of the Senate press corps. 3 top Senate observers pick their favorite moments from 39 years of the Senate on TV, and they tell us why each one is so memorable. Our 3 special guests for this podcast, Carl Hulse of the New York Times, Paul Kane of the Washington Post, and Chad Pergram of Fox News. Which top moments did each pick and why? Find out in The Weekly. Here's the clip Carl Hulse, chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times, picked.
Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye.
Be ordered to Senate, please.
Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Roberts. No. Mr. Roberts, no.
That's right. Senator Harry Reid first voted no, then quickly changed to yes. Huge laughs in the Senate. A footnote to that clip. After the vote, Senator Reid joked about it at a press conference.
I spent a very restless night last night trying to figure out how I could show some bipartisanship. And I think I was able to accomplish that for a few minutes today.
Okay, Carl Hulse, why did you pick that clip?
You know, that was such a surreal moment, and on so many levels, because that was actually Christmas Eve morning that year, and Washington had been in the middle of this big snowstorm, right? So the Democrats, led by Harry Reid, were trying to finish off the health care bill, which eventually became Obamacare, and they wanted to get it done before they left for the holidays. So, you know, Christmas Eve morning session it was. And I remember walking up to the Capitol, trudging really up there that morning. I live on Capitol Hill, and there was so much snow, and the streets were still clogged, and it was dark, and I'm walking in the middle of the street because it was the only way to get up there. So it's also in the Senate. It was this big solemn thing. You know, there'd been this huge fight over this health care bill, and Harry Reid, the Senate leader, had made all these side deals to get it through. The Democrats were getting it through with their 60-vote majority at the time, and that majority was in danger. It was going to be lost soon because of the death of Edward Kennedy. And so it's a solemn thing. Christmas Eve morning, they're voting, and we're all watching. They're voting from their desks. It's an important moment. And Harry Reid screws up the vote. You know, it was his vote. And we all sat there for a minute and go, what is he doing? And obviously it was a mistake, and it sort of broke the ice there for a while. But it was just really stuck with me, you know, the beauty of unscripted Senate action on TV.
Okay, so I have a few questions from that. One couple substantive, but one very technical question. When you go back and watch and listen to the clip, as we showed on C-SPAN, the funny thing is, and we heard it in the clip, you can hear the clerk calling the roll and the people voting aye, and over the senators voting aye. But when you actually get to the flub from Harry Reid, it's tough to pick that up, at least in the video, and you know, you hear the laughter. So when you're in the Senate press gallery, did you hear it better? Did you hear Harry Reid say no?
I think we thought we heard no. I mean, we heard it. Harry Reid had sort of a soft-spoken manner, and I actually raised this question with Dick Durbin recently when we were talking about this moment, and Durbin said he said something to him, you know, like I don't know if you can pick that up on the TV, that something to the extent that, hey, Harry, the vote on this is aye. I don't know, but you know, we could see, we knew that he had voted wrong, and then, but you know, there was enough. The clerk did not read out his no vote, if I'm remembering that correctly. So they gave him time to fix it.
In all your years of covering Congress and the Senate, have you seen that kind of moment before?
Well, not at such a big moment, right? You know, people vote wrong all the time, and especially in the House, because they're, you know, using the little cards, right? So it's not like the Senate where they still vote individually, even when they're just running in and out. But people vote wrong, but not at that. And this was his crowning moment too. You know, that's the thing that really adds to it. He had worked tirelessly to deliver this bill for Obama, and here he was, and he's like, you know, they couldn't lose any votes. So, and then I believe that he later on voted the wrong way again on this. It's at some future date. And he must have had some kind of weird mental block on this. That's all I can say. But, you know, it's not a lot of big, funny, uproarious moments on the Senate floor, and that was one that stuck with me. And because it was such an odd day to begin with. I think that vote was at 7 a.m. Because that's when time had expired. And everything about it was weird. You know, we were all in there. Everybody had Christmas ties on. There was all sorts of unusual things happening that day in the Senate. So
it was, at that point, so much, you're right, the atmospherics are so interesting. It was, as you say, in the early morning, Christmas, December 24th, 2009. Is it a packed press gallery in the Senate? Yeah, it was packed. Everybody was in there. It was packed. And I will say this, there was actually
some early Christmas celebration going on in there because it was so hot.
Define celebration for us, please.
I mean, I think there might have been like a Christmas toddy being passed around. It was, because everybody knew it was going to be over quick, although we had to write all our stories. And it was really, it was extraordinary. But it was also extremely funny, and it was sort of this weird Harry Reid thing, who was an unusual guy in many respects anyway.
And I would imagine, since you were such a junkie of covering the Senate, you weren't really bothered by being there the day before Christmas. You actually probably...
Yeah, it was one of those ones, obviously. I still remember it, decades later. It was just one of those odd ones. And the snow really made it, too. You couldn't really even drive on the roads yet. So it was something. And it was one of those, honestly, because of C-SPAN televising the Senate. A lot of times we're not actually in the chamber for the Senate votes because we're watching it on TV and filing. And Harry Reid himself used to criticize me occasionally for not being in the chamber enough watching it on TV. But that was one of those moments where we were all in the chamber in our seats watching it.
So, and the point about C-SPAN covering it since 1986 and C-SPAN2, you've been in the Senate, covering the Senate for for 40 years, right?
For all of that, right. I mean, I distinctly remember C-SPAN starting the coverage of the Senate, and it was a big debate, and obviously if the House Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich, hadn't been so good at using the television appearances on C-SPAN to kind of promote their agenda and themselves, I don't know that Robert Byrd, who was running the Senate those days, would have ever agreed to it. But I know that the Senate didn't want to be overtaken by the House in public interest, that's for sure. And, it's a godsend, obviously, to people who cover Congress. We can't always be there. And it's just really makes it possible for us to do our jobs. You do miss things on the Senate floor if you're watching on TV. You can, as a reporter, kind of lean over the railing there and hear conversations on the floor, that sort of thing. So there is a value still to being in the chamber, but the Senate has really been slower than the House to let us have our phones in there or laptops. You still can't do that. And I do think it's a tragedy, honestly, that still photographers have not been able to take pictures in the Senate at some big moments. I think a lot of history has honestly been lost there.
If there was one debate, and this will be my final question of you, Carl, but if there was one debate before Senate TV that you would have wished TV was around for, one big legendary Senate debate, what would you have wanted to see televised?
I guess I would have wanted to see some of the Civil War debates, right? Wasn't the caning, didn't that actually happen on the Senate floor?
Right.
But I think some of those, would have been interesting. Or some of the early debates, when Aaron Burr would have been presiding as vice president. I think, I kind of am really a nut for some of the early American history, and that would have been interesting to watch. Some of those debates, they didn't even let the public watch early on in Philadelphia. The Senate, I think, was closed to spectators at some point. So hail C-SPAN, though, I'll say that.
Well, that's so kind of you. I want to hail Carl Hulse. Is there anything of yours, Carl, that we can mention, books you're working on? I know you've written books. If anything, I can have people flock to Carl Hulse content.
Honestly, I'm actually working on a historical thriller right now that is related to World War II and doesn't have much to do with Congress, but hoping to get that out in the next year or so.
Well, we want to talk about that when it comes out. So thank you for breaking that news here on C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly. Carl Hulse, Chief Washington Correspondent of the New York Times, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you guys. Honestly, I really appreciate C-SPAN and think it's just such a public service, and people get so much out of it. So thank you for what you guys do.
Great. Thanks, Carl. Here's the clip Paul Kane, senior congressional correspondent of the Washington Post, picked. It's July 9th, 2008. The Senate is voting on Medicare. It's a bill to increase Medicare payment for doctors. 60 yes votes are needed to advance the bill. Suddenly, during the vote, Senator Ted Kennedy, Democrat from Massachusetts, makes a dramatic appearance. It's Ted Kennedy's first time in the Senate chamber in 2 months, since he was found to be suffering from a brain tumor. He is escorted by fellow Democratic Senators Barack Obama, the 2008 presidential nominee, and John Kerry of Massachusetts, the 2004 nominee, and by his son, Representative Patrick Kennedy of Rhode Island.
Ms. Mikulski, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Obama, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Salazar, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer.
Okay, Paul Kane, why did you pick that clip?
That clip is emblematic of the Senate of a different era. It really isn't that long ago, July 2008. We're talking less than 17 years ago. This isn't like, the dark ages of the FDR administration or something like that. It was a time when one senator could actually be worth 10 votes. So the backstory is the legislation really wasn't that significant. That's not why I picked it. It was something we called the doc fix. You mentioned it earlier. There was a 1997 budget bill that got the federal books back to balance. There was even some surplus in the late 90s, pre-9/11 aughts. And one of the ways that they reduced spending in that bill was something to restrict Medicare payments to physicians. And after a few years, Congress realized that cutting payments to doctors who treat Medicare is really bad politics. So every year, sometimes twice a year, depending on how they would handle things, they would just they would eliminate the cut and increase the payment to doctors. Well, in the early summer of 2008, Democrats had a 51-49 majority. And Mitch McConnell, as the still new minority leader, was digging in and creating fights here and there. And he was putting up a fight over, this was a must-pass thing. He knew that it would eventually pass, but he was throwing up, all sorts of sand in the gears to try and slow things down, and was trying to push for getting, side deals here or there on this must-pass bill. So Republicans filibustered, blocked a bill in June that was designed to do the doc fix. A whole bunch of people missed that vote, including Senators Obama and Clinton, who were either still campaigning in Puerto Rico, which was the last place to vote in that epic 2008 Democratic presidential primary, or they may have just been, taking a breather after their epic primary. Also, Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts did not vote because just a couple weeks earlier he had a seizure and he'd been diagnosed with glioblastoma, the form of brain cancer that would eventually take his life, would eventually take John McCain's life, Beau Biden's life, and many others, sadly. A very aggressive form of brain cancer. But after you did all the math of that earlier vote of who was missing, which Republicans had already voted with them, Harry Reid at the time knew he was basically sitting at 59 votes and 60 if Kennedy would come back from the family compound in Hyannisport. And he secretly worked a deal with Reid in which he would get to Boston, he would do a treatment in the morning, and then there would be a private jet that would get him down to Washington, and Reid scheduled this vote for that afternoon on July 9th, and everybody kind of started buzzing, like, why is he scheduling a vote that at best he's going to get 59 on? I mean, he's got to get Obama to come back. Clinton had just came back after the presidential race. What's going on here? And so the buzz started building of, like, Ted Kennedy. If he shows up, Reid has 60 votes, and this bill is going to pass. Now, Kennedy was a larger-than-life figure in the Senate. He gets elected in 1962 to take the seat of his brother, then President John Kennedy. He goes through lots of trials and tribulations. He drives off a bridge. A woman dies. He sort of gives up presidential ambition, then does a presidential campaign where he primaries Jimmy Carter. When he finally gives up all the hope of running for president, he commits all his life to the Senate. And healthcare was the cause of his life, is what he had said all along. And he begins working in this bipartisan manner and becomes a beloved figure of the Senate on both sides of the aisle. People like McCain and Orrin Hatch adore Ted Kennedy. And so when Kennedy shows up, in that presidential primary, he did an incredible thing and endorsed Obama despite a long relationship between himself and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. And it was seen as a torch-passing moment in his family's, political lexicon. And Obama goes on to win the primary and becomes very, very close with the Kennedy family. And so when they arrange this surprise for Kennedy to show up, there are his closest friends, John Kerry of Massachusetts, Barack Obama is there, his son Patrick, who would serve a couple more years in the House before retiring. And you see instantly, the moment he shows up, everybody starts cheering, both sides of the aisle. And the other reason that I picked this is because then 9 Republicans who had previously been voting no on this bill immediately realize this thing's going to pass. Democrats are in great position for 2008. Republicans are on the defensive. My gosh, I want to be on the right side of this vote. I don't want seniors angry at me. And it was people like John Cornyn in fairly reliably conservative Texas are among those who switched their vote to yes. And all of a sudden, we go from a vote in which we think Democrats are only going to get 59. They end up with 10 more votes. Ted Kennedy plus 9. It was a different Senate, a different era in which one senator in one day could technically be worth 10 votes.
It's amazing when you say it's a different era when it really was 20, as you said, 20 odd years ago. I mean, it wasn't...
Yeah, not even 17
Not even
years.
17, right. Set up some of the atmospherics of that moment. Are you in the Senate press gallery when that's happening?
Yes. Okay. I remember being up in the gallery above. That's the sort of third floor, looking down below onto the Senate floor, which is the second floor on the Capitol. A bunch of reporters had gone outside because they were, we had the whiff of a surprise was coming. So
wait, let me stop you there. The whiff. This is so fascinating. You are not. Are you surprised when Ted Kennedy walks on the floor, or when you say whiff? What does that mean in journalism?
It means that by early in the morning, when Reid had scheduled the vote a day or so before, I think everybody started to say, this is really dumb if he's just going to lose. And all it's going to do is highlight that, poor Ted Kennedy has brain cancer and can't get here. Or Obama had a presidential campaign event and Kennedy was sick and he couldn't get here. It looked like a loser vote. But by that morning, Harry Reid had this way about him. There was the man from Searchlight, Nevada, who was, quiet, meek, but hardworking. And then there was Las Vegas Harry Reid, when the guy who pretty much knew that he was going to roll 7, and he had a sort of little bit of swagger to him. He knew the dice were going to come up his way. And so that morning he had that walk about him. And so we all kind of knew and started beginning to try and source things out and calling people in Kennedy's orbit. One of Reid's top communication staffer, longtime aide, Jim Manley, had worked for Ted Kennedy for 10 years, and so there were some back channels there. And so we didn't know for certain, but we were all sniffing around for, all right, is he showing up? He must be showing up. We heard Obama's coming, because, at that point he's the nominee de facto, and so you have Poole and things like that get notified, Obama's coming back. All right, everybody's going to be back. But Kennedy, I think he's coming back.
All right. So again, let's pick up there. So you are where when he walks in?
I'm up above, which is if you're watching TV and you're looking at the sort of the rostrum, directly above is the press gallery, about 4 or 5 rows devoted to the press. And so we would be directly above where the President pro tem of the Senate would be presiding. And Kennedy comes in on the Democratic side of the floor, which is sort of down to our right, to the left side of the chamber if you're down there on the floor as a senator. And, I think in my recollection, I knew he was there because of the cheering. We couldn't even quite see him at first. And one of the more awkward things, we learned this afterward, was that the orders went out from Vicki Kennedy, his wife, and doctors to people like Kerry and Obama and Chris Dodd, keep people away from him. He's undergoing serious chemo treatment right now. The slightest infection could turn into something very, very bad. But it's Ted Kennedy. And so there's just applause, and I remember Kay Bailey Hutchison, the Republican from Texas, just jumping out of her chair and running down the aisle and just running up and hugging him. And other people were hugging him. And Obama and Kerry are just don't get, whatever,
When we played the clip and he talked about the applause, the clip was a long clip that we played primarily because of the length of the applause. And it's have you heard? Do you typically hear that much clapping and cheering on the Senate floor for one person?
The Senate floor doesn't get that way except for every 2 years in December, when senators who are retiring and leaving the chamber will deliver their farewell speeches. And those moments, they tend to say, it's okay, we can cheer, it's all right. I don't know that I've ever heard an ovation quite that big, because it was so spontaneous and it had the rawness that you get almost in sports, where you're not sure whether the shot's going to go in as the buzzer is sounding. You think like, wow, maybe he is going to show up, maybe he's not going to show up, maybe LeBron James or Steph Curry is going to hit the shot, and boom, it goes in. And so everybody just burst out cheering in a way that, wasn't something you were preparing for.
All right, I want to ask you one more question about this. I love the sports analogy, cliffhanger. I'm going to put you on the spot. Forgive me if you haven't had time to think about this. I just thought of this. Have you had a cliffhanger like that in other situations where you really, and the way the sports analogy is great, where you just didn't know what was going to happen? Not necessarily a vote, but like a dramatic moment like that.
Usually those come on election night where it's a close race and you're not sure what's going to happen.
But on the Senate floor, watching
on the Senate floor, no. Like over on the House floor, the House is kind of is nutty. Those things happen. The Senate, and like today's Senate, has become almost sterile. Like you don't quite have nearly as much debate. Legislative debate is reserved for, the total number of votes every year that your website will crank out every 2 years. This amazing year Congress and statistics that you guys create. There's so many votes that are just on nominations, and actual legislation. You pretty much know well in advance. Like they can do vote-a-rama on a budget resolution that will last 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, and the vote comes at 4 a.m. But the end, like the Republicans have the votes. That's why they started vote-a-rama. And you don't quite get this in the Senate anymore. And that's also why I wanted to pick this particular moment, because it spoke to a time and an era where the biggest figures in the Senate of that time were not the majority leader and the minority leader. Harry Reid faced a lot of criticism back then from his left that he just wasn't powerful enough, and they compared him very unfavorably to Nancy Pelosi. The committee chairs were big deals. Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, big figures. Joe Biden as Senate Foreign Relations Chair at the time was a big deal, and BFD, as he would later say about a bill that President Obama signed and was about to be picked to be the vice president. John McCain was the Republican nominee at that time. So Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell were smaller figures, and that Senate of that time was just a better place, more fun. Today's Senate has gotten a lot more diverse, and that's a good, important thing. But in that same time, we've seen so much power consolidated into the two leaders' offices that we don't get moments like this anymore.
Okay, final question, Paul, then we'll let you go. You're talking about the way the Senate used to be. Go back before there was Senate TV. Would there have been any debate or moment before the technology existed to put Senate on TV before 1986 that you wish you could have seen on TV? Any big moments, any big debates going back to the pre-TV days that a young Paul Kane or even earlier would have said, I wish I could see this? The filibuster is fresh in our minds because Cory Booker just went and led a 25-hour marathon speech, and I think there were some filibusters of the civil rights era that would have been interesting if we could see them and in their full totality, and also to see the end of them and to watch the Civil Rights Bill, the Civil Rights Acts get passed by the Senate. I think that would have been an interesting dynamic to be able to see the visual of Strom Thurmond going 24 hours and 18 minutes
and then also seeing the final vote as the legislation passed.
Paul Kane, you've been so generous with your time. People who want to read and consume more Paul Kane content, you have a great Sunday Washington Post column, just a tremendous read about the inside workings of the Congress. What else can we mention for people who want more Paul Kane reporting and observations?
I am on both X, sometimes called Twitter, and Blue Sky. The Blue Sky formulation is kind of complicated, but just do Paul Kane, Washington Post, Blue Sky, if that's your thing. And the handle on X Twitter is at PK Capitol with an OL ending. Always a reminder for the Capitol building. You're just going to have to periodically, though, endorse some Philadelphia sports in that Twitter Blue Sky feed.
How much Philadelphia sports is mixed up into that? Like, what's the ratio?
Not a whole lot.
All right, so
we us expats living here in D.C. have our own email and text chains that we can cheer and complain about. So those feeds are pretty well political, congressional related.
Perfect. Paul Kane of the Washington Post, thank you so much for being part of this.
Anytime. Happy to do it.
Here's the clip Chad Pergram, senior congressional correspondent for Fox News, picked. It's February 28, 1995. Senators are debating whether to amend the U.S. Constitution. The Balanced Budget Amendment would require the federal government to balance its budget by 2002, or 2 years after ratification by the states. Republican Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole and longtime Democratic Senator from West Virginia Robert Byrd are feuding. The reason for the argument? Senate leadership postponed the vote until the next day. When you listen to this clip, keep in mind that Democratic leader Tom Daschle is merely a bystander, saying nothing, just watching the two Senate giants go at it.
The Majority Leader.
Madam President, I move the Senate stand at recess till 10 a.m. Wednesday, March 1st. I'd ask that further proceeding of the quorum call be rescinded.
Okay, without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, before the senator makes his motion, would he explain to the Senate why we're going out and why we're not having a vote, as we all anticipated that we would be having a vote?
Let me explain to my friend from West Virginia. We still think there's some chance of getting this resolved by tomorrow morning so that we'll have 67 votes, or maybe more. We've been on this now for 115 hours, I don't know how many days. Everybody's had a right debate. We're up to the critical time of the vote. And this senator wants to make every effort he can to see if we can reach the 67 votes. If we fail, we'll fail. It'll be some 10 o'clock or some between 10 and noon tomorrow morning. So I would renew the motion.
Mr. President, would the senator allow me 5 minutes before he makes that motion? But I ask unanimous consent.
Does the chair hear any objections?
No.
If not, the senator may proceed.
Madam President, I thank the distinguished majority leader for allowing me to have this privilege to address this question before he makes the motion to adjourn. Madam President, would senators please be seated?
The senator makes a point. Would everyone take their seats?
Madam President, I think this is a sad spectacle. We've had 30 days of debate. Both sides have poured out their hearts, have worked hard, and we came to the moment that we thought we were going to have a roll call vote. We entered into an agreement to that effect. Now, if we had known that we were going to reach this kind of a travesty, this senator would never have agreed to that unanimous consent agreement. And it may be hard to enter into agreements hereafter. Madam President, the framers intended that before the people at the state level have an opportunity to ratify a constitutional amendment, that it should be approved by both houses of the Congress by a 2/3 vote. And it was here that the amendment was supposed to be probed and examined and carefully studied before it was sent on its way to the states. Now here's what we see. We see the sad spectacle of senators on the other side trying to go over until tomorrow in order to get another vote for this amendment. It should be obvious to everyone that the main object here is to get that vote, as the distinguished majority leader said. And so it boils down to an insatiable desire to get a vote for victory. We're tampering with the Constitution of the United States. This is no place for deal making, backroom huddles. No wonder the people have such a low estimation of the Congress. We're going to make deals in the back rooms. And I don't imply by what I'm saying, I don't cast any, I don't want to cast any aversions on any senator in particular, but this is a process. We've worked our way through it. We were told there'd be a vote. We've waited on the vote. Up here, the press is gathered. They want to see the outcome of this action, of this debate.
Chair will remind those occupants in the galleries that there will be no expressions of approval or disapproval.
Madam President, this has every appearance of a sleazy, tawdry effort to win a victory at the cost of a constitutional amendment, at the cost of amending the Constitution of the United States. We've had our chances. Why don't we vote? I hope we'll vote, Madam President. Let's don't wait until tomorrow. Now is the time for the decision. That's what we were told. I deplore this tawdry effort here to go over to tomorrow.
All right, Chad Pergram, why did you pick that clip?
I remember it as being one of the most high-profile and high-drama moments that I saw on the Senate floor for a couple of different reasons. Number one, you had Republicans that had just won control of the House and Senate. It was, significant because this was part of the contract with America. Republicans got control of the House in 1994, those famous midterm elections. Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House. And so they had these 10 agenda items that they were ticking through. And the House signed on to this. The Senate did not. They got control of the House and Senate, the Republicans did. And so this was really the first signal that they weren't going to get all of these things through. I mean, they did eventually get everything through the House of Representatives, but it was a struggle in the Senate. They only got a couple of them, and they didn't fully commit to that. And they knew that these were really, as we would call them today, messaging bills. So what happened was it was, to amend the Constitution, okay, there's a very high bar there. And so they had Mark Hatfield, who was the Republican senator from Oregon, who at the time was a committee chairman. And there was concern about just having enough votes. And so nobody knew. We get these votes periodically in Congress where you go up to the precipice and one or two people become kind of the people you're looking at in the wheelhouse as to whether or not they're going to actually vote yes or no, because this is on a knife's edge here. It could go either way. And so Bob Dole, then the majority leader, he had teed up by unanimous consent when this vote would be. And so Bob Dole realized he did not have the votes. And after a long quorum call, came down to the floor. Everybody was sitting there just waiting, rapt attention, high drama in the Senate. It was an evening. And just said, I'm going to, not have the vote tonight, and we're going to adjourn and come back tomorrow. Well, you know as well as I do, you have to ask unanimous consent to do that. And the Democrats, just because it was Bob Dole, we're talking Bob Dole here, presidential candidate, was going to be the presidential nominee for the Republicans in 1996. They're going to give him a lot of deference, but they're like, we're not going to do it without a bit of a fight. Now, the other dynamic in this was that you had Tom Daschle, who was the new Democratic leader, had just taken over from George Mitchell, who had retired, the Democrat from Maine. And Tom Daschle is there, and we've used this in other references here where Hakeem Jeffries, for instance, when he became the Democratic leader, but Nancy Pelosi is still hanging around. I asked him at one point, would he have a Byrd problem, meaning Robert Byrd, the legendary senator from West Virginia. And so Tom Daschle really wasn't a player in this. You have somebody who is an absolute guardian of the Constitution and an absolute guardian of prerogatives and precedents and the rules in the Senate, Robert Byrd. There's probably only 4 or 5 senators who are as consequential in the history of the Senate as Robert Byrd. And so he flipped out, basically. Basically said, wait a minute, because he knew that his side had won. Byrd repeatedly in those early months of 1995 spoke out against the contract with America. In many speeches, he often called it the contract on America. And he would pull from his breast pocket a copy of the Constitution and say, this is my contract with America. He did this over and over and over again. So when he realized that they had basically defeated the Democrats, the Republicans, I should say, he was not going to go down without a fight. And he kind of pushes his way past Tom Daschle. I mean, Tom Daschle is, and to give great deference here and respect to Tom Daschle, though, he's the new Democratic leader. The Democrats lost control of the Senate. He's the rookie just up from Norfolk, suddenly in the show. He's dealing with Bob Dole and dealing with Robert Byrd. And so Tom Daschle just kind of is going to sit there and, who am I? What can I possibly do? So he lets them just kind of go at it. And you see in the video, he kind of is just standing in the wings in the back there and letting these 2 Senate masters go at it, Bob Dole and Robert Byrd. And what I thought was extraordinary. So they did call off the vote that night. I remember Byrd said, the press has gathered because the press galleries were absolutely packed. And somebody kind of chortled at that as though they were doing this just for the press. It was the time for the press.
It's interesting, watching, as you mentioned, watching the clip, it took me a couple of replays to really get the flavor of why you picked it. I mean, you were demonstrating, just as you described, Tom Daschle in the background. Mm-hmm. That's not something you see anymore, right? Like you would see the majority, the leaders of both parties now in 2025, this is 30 years ago, mm-hmm. Defer to someone who is not of a position then. That's not the case now, right?
Right. And Robert Byrd, again, he hadn't been the leader since early 1989. He stepped aside, had some health problems. He wanted to continue to chair the Appropriations Committee or be the ranking Democrat. He had been the Democratic leader or whip for years and years. And so, but the respect of Robert Byrd by both sides of the aisle. And there's more going on behind the scenes of that. So they came back and tried to do this the next day. They never had the votes to do this, to amend the Constitution. That's a very high bar, 2/3, as you know. So that's why the Hatfield vote was so key. The Senate Republican Conference was going to meet. They talked about taking away his chairmanship, maybe throwing him out of the conference. I mean, we're talking about big stuff because Mark Hatfield was one of these kind of old-style Republicans. He was, conservative when it came to fiscal issues, but when it came to social issues and stuff like that, he was a little bit different. And he's somebody who would vote with the Democrats. We have kind of these sectors now. Everybody's either in one corner or the other. He was somebody, and there were a lot of people in the middle. They were certainly Republicans or they were certainly Democrats, but they voted in the middle. And that's why he bucked his party, basically. And eventually, the Republicans in the Senate realized that was just going to create more problems for them if they, were punitive in disciplining Mark Hatfield. And that was the end of the balanced budget amendment.
So sounds like you just had a lot of different political dramas cascading at the same time. You had the Republicans and Hatfield, Daschle kind of new to the position, mm-hmm. and Robert Byrd's sacrosanct defending of the Constitution, all colliding on the Senate floor at that moment.
That's right. And to say nothing of the idea that, this was that the political part of this, the contract with America, which Gingrich and the House Republicans won the House on. Granted, some of the polling later said most people didn't know what the contract with America was, but, the pickings were ripe. There's a reason why they were able to flip the House for the first time in 4 decades with that election. And it also really, if you really take a very long view, was probably in some ways the beginning of the end for Gingrich, because this, even though this had nothing to do with his ability to move things through the House, what it did was demonstrate the limits of his powers, even though he was riding as high as possible at that point, becoming the first Republican speaker since the 1950s. It just wasn't, this wasn't something that they were going to be able to effectuate. It was great politics. It was great TV, what they were doing. I remember the contract with America. They even took out a TV ad and a TV guide, and the idea that you could do a checkbox, for each time they marked off something at home. Not that anybody gets a TV guide anymore, Howard, but but you get the idea. I mean, it was really smart politics for the age. But it was just that. It was politics. It wasn't necessarily getting something done. So
you're a sharp observer of the Senate. I mean, this is what you do for a living. Are there moments like that anymore? Have you seen really high drama like that? I don't want to overstate the drama involved, because you really had to have the fine-tuned eye to see what was happening, all the mechanics. But does that kind of activity go on anymore?
It does from time to time. I mean, I remember, obviously, and this is something that just came up the other day, I had a TV piece where we were talking about how the relationship between President Trump and Republicans in Congress are much different, much better from their perspective than the Republicans in Congress when he had his first term in 2017. And the moment that everybody remembers was John McCain, the late John McCain, the senator from Arizona, basically blowing up their effort to repeal and replace Obamacare in July of 2017. And he famously came down to the well and gave the thumbs down. And, in fact, I was talking to somebody off the air about this, and it's, is that the thumbs down? And there was this audible murmuring in the people, ooh, when he did that, because they knew that was dead. And again, if you look at the video, you look at Mitch McConnell, then the majority leader, he's kind of, his head is down, he's sullen, he looks like a man without a country. You do get those moments. But they're limited. There are other moments that I recall, some that I was not here for, but some I have actually on a VHS tape. And this goes back to the early days, some of the earliest days of the Senate being on television and therefore being on C-SPAN, C-SPAN2, there was an absolute brawl in about May of 1987. And if you're a real parliamentary geek or nerd, you're really going to get into this. It was basically Robert Byrd was trying to get onto a defense bill. And there are some provisions in the Senate rules, what's called the morning hour. Now, the morning hour does not necessarily take place in the morning, nor is it an hour. And if you listen to the patter in the Senate when they adjourn the night before, you always hear, and the morning hour be deemed as expired, is the phraseology you hear. Deemed as expired. In other words, it didn't actually expire, but we deem it to be expired. In other words, you can't use it, because what happens is that there was some agility for the other side to be able, if you really knew the rules, like Robert Byrd did, and this is when the Democrats were in the majority back in 1987, you could do things, and he could also test the other side. And so what the Republicans did is they figured out they were going to suck up all the time in the morning hour. And what they were going to do is they were going to force a series of roll call votes. Now, Howard, these were just not any old roll call votes. They are roll call votes just in the sense that they were a vote, but they were really designed to mess this up. And this is frequently referred to in Capitol Hill circles as the morning hour from hell. Because what happened is you had Rudy Boschwitz, who was a senator from Minnesota at the time. You had Senator Dan Quayle, future vice president. You had Senator John Warner. And what they did, and I think it started with John Warner, is he said that, so he basically, I think they had some sort of a quorum call or procedural vote ahead of that. And Warner said, I refuse to vote because I have not read the journal. I think it was a journal vote is what it was. And so you're basically taking attendance and just seeing who's really here and who's not. And so I've never heard of somebody saying I can't vote on the journal because I've not read the journal. Okay, that's pretty creative. And so that gummed up the works. and then Boschwitz when it came time for him to vote, and when it came time for Senator Quayle, they basically said the same thing. This is the weird part. I've never seen this, and you'll never see this again. Imagine you have a roll call vote going on, and in the middle of that roll call vote, you have a senator saying that he or she will not vote because of X. And then the question in the Senate becomes, can we compel this senator to vote? And so what you had were multi-concentric circles of roll call votes. If that initial roll call vote, which started the whole thing, was going on, then you had another concentric circle of whether or not we should compel Senator Warner to vote, and then Quayle and Boschwitz. And then it took them to about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And again, you have Robert Byrd and Bob Dole going at it on the floor. 2 masters, 2 Jedi masters of their craft, really dealing with it. And I remember John Breaux was a Republican senator from Louisiana, just a freshman at that point, been elected in 1986, and he's in the chair. And you know that they often put these junior senators in the chair because they're just there to eat up time. And they need somebody who doesn't have as important things, not a committee chairman. So they went and got Wendell Ford, who was the Democratic senator from Kentucky, and at the time was the Democratic whip, because they needed a senior person. And so Bob Dole is giving his objections, stretching this out on the floor. And of course, because it's leader time, they get as much time as they're allowed to speak. And of course, it's the order that the majority leader is recognized first, the minority leader second, and so they have that kind of command on the floor. That's kind of an informal Senate custom. So Wendell Ford tries subtly to cut off Bob Dole amid all this. And, again, you're also dealing with Bob Dole. Okay, big deal. And there was at one point where Wendell Ford said, he said, well, I'm walking a fine line. The chair is walking a fine line, because he didn't want to rule Bob Dole out of order, the minority leader. He didn't want to, discipline him in some way. But he's like, you're really pushing it, Senator Dole. And only because of my respect and probably friendship for you am I letting you do this. And then the ruling came, and if you actually look at, the Senate operates a lot on precedent. And so the precedent to be in that situation is if you were to find yourself in that situation again, you can speak for a little bit, but you can't go on and on. The reason is that Wendell Ford basically said from the chair, and utterances from the chair sometimes, then become the precedent, said, you can go for a little bit, but you can't go on and on. Now, what is on and on? I don't know. But that is the precedent that was established in that situation.
All right, last question for you, Chad Program. We've been talking about this, the Senate on TV, the beginning of C-SPAN 2 in 1986. If you can go back further than that, if you can put TV in the chamber for big, momentous Senate debates or votes earlier than 1986, what would you have liked to have seen on TV? On Senate TV?
If a tree falls in the forest, if nobody's around, nobody knows, nobody hears it. This is a little cliche, but it's important. And it's important because of things that have happened in recent weeks. I want cameras in the chamber for the Strom-Thurmond, quote, filibuster, close quote, from the late 1950s. The reason is because, and I remember learning this in school, and everybody said, Strom-Thurmond holds the record for the longest speech in Senate history. Filibuster. He read from the telephone book. I just did a piece on Fox that talked about what was a filibuster and why what Cory Booker did was not a filibuster. He spoke for more than 25 hours. You had Strom-Thurmond clocking in about 24. Here's the problem with not having cameras and electronic devices and all the things we have in modern society. So Thurmond takes the floor in the evening. So most reporters are not there. There's no cell phones. There's no iPhones. There's no anything. Probably a couple of phone calls to editors, maybe from some people that were there. Maybe this gets on the radio that night. I'm not talking live radio, but in radio reports, because people might have. But it probably took them a while to even figure it out. Probably the next morning, because we have people get up and start talking, and you don't follow till the next. So all the reporters come into the Capitol. He's been here all night. So you get into really day 2 of this, and then you get into when it finally hits the papers, and he establishes the record, you're into day 3. You don't have this instantaneous thing that Cory Booker, with his lengthy speech, which was not a filibuster because he was technically not holding something up. That's the definition of a filibuster. You have to have, there's no pending question there that you have to vote on or something like that. And so Thurmond, and again, this is where I come back to the tree in a forest, he supposedly left the chamber multiple times, used the restroom, got a sandwich in the cloakroom. You have no idea how much time I've spent researching this over the years. He allowed Lyndon Johnson, who was then the majority leader, to swear in a senator, approve a couple of bills by unanimous consent. Now, if you go back to what Cory Booker and other people who've held the floor for prolonged periods of time in recent years, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, et cetera, also not filibusters, by the way, Jeff Merkley as well, the deal is that you have to be on your feet. And what you see the senators do is they sometimes yield for a question. And what I saw Senator Booker repeatedly doing is he would, you kind of stand there, you kind of lean, et cetera. Some senators could probably call you on that and say, or if you have an aggressive chair, a point of order that this is not how it's going. They don't do that because the Senate is a body of equals. They go, but for the grace of God. I might be in that position someday, and I'm not going to call out Senator Booker because I might want to do that when my pet issue that's up, my ox is being gored someday. So they don't do that. So yielding for a question, I remember Senator Gillibrand from New York went on and on for a long period of time, and then at the end said to Booker, Senator Booker, what do you think about that? That was the question. That's legal, because you've yielded for a question. But it gives the senator who's holding the floor for the prolonged period of time a timeout. It's kind of like bringing in a relief pitcher from the bullpen for an inning or two. Only you can put somebody else back in.
All right, one final question, a bonus question. Chad Pergram of Fox News, you have a personal connection to C-SPAN. What is that personal connection to C-SPAN?
Well, this was my first job in Washington. I had worked in news before I came here, starting in high school and college and graduate school in Ohio. And the first job that I got was here at C-SPAN. There was somebody else I was leaving grad school, and this person was coming to grad school at Miami. And so I briefly passed them and said, oh, here's somebody who I just got a call from. And they referred me to Kate Mills. And I didn't know who Kate Mills was, and so I called her and another gentle lady who worked here at the time, Susan Bundock, and they kind of shared a position because they were both new mothers at the time. And so like they one worked half the week, the other one worked the other half the week. And so they said they didn't have anything right now because they had filled that position. And I thought, well, okay, they're not going to hear from them. And I remember literally I stayed here in Washington in the Washington area with a friend's family for a couple of weeks while I looked for an apartment. I just got in the truck and I'd lived here, and I was looking for a job. And literally right as I was about to go back home and catch a train from Union Station just up the way here to then bring my other truck out with all the stuff, I got 3 calls in a row for jobs, and one of them was Kate Mills from C-SPAN. And they said, can you come out for an interview? And I literally, so I booked the interview, and I came back, and I worked here for 3.5 years and was the Senate producer at C-SPAN. And that's why I remember this night, we were talking about the moments between Bob Dole and Robert Byrd and Mark Hatfield. I was here that night.
Well, on behalf of Kate Mills, our boss here at C-SPAN Podcast Land, Chad, thank you so much for coming in and sharing all those memories with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of C-SPAN's Podcast The Weekly. A huge thanks to Paul Kane of The Washington Post, Carl Hulse of The New York Times, and Chad Pergram of Fox News for joining us and sharing their top moments from the U.S. Senate on television. A reminder to keep watching the U.S. Senate on C-SPAN 2 and pick your own favorite Senate TV moments by using the C-SPAN video library. For now, thanks for listening and happy searching.